Okay, guys, so for today's video, I wanted to talk about affirmative action. Now, it just recently got overturned by the Supreme Court, and I did a short on it just yesterday, I believe. And it was a short on a clip from Joy Reid. If you missed it, here's the clip.
Well, let me just be clear. I got into Harvard only because of affirmative action. I went to a school no one had ever heard of in Denver, Colorado, in a small suburb. I just happened to be really nerdy and smart and have really good grades and good SAT scores. Right. Really not saying we're going to take an unqualified person and put them in Harvard. Yes. We're going to take a very qualified person. The minute I arrived, my presence was questioned by white people, where some white students stood up and said, those students, the black students, they're only here because of affirmative action. I had never had my academic credentials questioned. I had never had anyone question whether I was intelligent until I got to Harvard. And yet, some of the people I went to school with were far less smart than me or the other black folk there.
Now, people were saying, oh, you didn't understand the clip. She's trying to say that without affirmative action, she would never have been seen or found because she was in a small, unknown named school in Denver, yada, yada. And to that, I say, I completely understand that point. Although my view is that her education system is what actually failed her. Because if she was getting grades that were good enough and qualify her to get into Harvard, as they saw when they recruited her, as she said, her teachers, her educators, her counselors, they were the ones who should have told a young Joy Reid and any other young black student, white student, Asian student, Hispanic student, any young student who's putting in that time and the effort to get good grades, and the teachers and educators and the counselors are able to see that, they should have informed her as a young child, with grades like this, with test scores like this, you could really apply anywhere you wanted. If you want to go to Yale, if you want to go to Harvard, if you want to go to Stanford or any other Ivy League school. Affirmative action definitely, in my opinion, was not the way to go down this. And as she mentions, it's like a double-edged sword. Sure, affirmative action helped her get seen, but then she's only seen through the lens of affirmative action. It's not based off of her test marks or her scores or her grades or anything like that. Everyone just says, oh, you're only here due to affirmative action. Like, why would anybody want to put themselves into that category? And hey, maybe it doesn't bother some people, but I would hate the idea that I now have to go through university or college trying to prove that A, I'm smart enough to be here, B, that I wasn't only here due to affirmative action and my race, and C, constantly being questioned again on how I made it here. Now, there is one thing that Joy does talk about in that clip after a certain portion, which I 100% agree with her. So I'll play that part now.
Arrived from my majority black little town, Montbello in Denver, to Harvard, the first week or two that I was in class, my presence was questioned by white people. I was in this big conference class where some white students stood up and said, those students, the black students, they're only here because of affirmative action. It became a huge argument that we all ended up having. This was freshman year. I had never had my academic credentials questioned. I had never had anyone question whether I was intelligent until I got to Harvard. And it was a defining point of my experience there. It's why I really was one of the many reasons I was miserable there my freshman year. Yeah. You felt completely out of place, and people keep telling you shouldn't be here. And yet, some of the people I went to school with were far less smart than me or the other black folk there. They got in because their daddy and their granddaddy. I went to school with somebody whose name was on one of the buildings. You're going to school with people whose names are on the buildings, who are third and fourth generation legacies, whose parents pumped money into Harvard to get them in.
And she's totally right. Legacy admissions or legacy students, form of nepotism, all that kind of stuff is ridiculous. Just because your dad or your grandpappy or your granddad or whoever it was went to this school should not mean that you're entitled to also go to this school or have a spot. And as well as just because you have money or you've donated a lot of money to the school or your name is on a building, again, should not mean that you got in. That's why we test off objective things like your intelligence, your skills, how well you test, how far you can go. That's how it should be done. Also, just like affirmative action, on the flip side, legacy students, in my opinion, are the same thing where some people would say, you've only gotten in here because your parents have money or because your daddy paid your way in. Like, again, I wouldn't want to be a legacy student. So, yes, I 100% agree that they should abolish that as well. And here's just another little quick clip of somebody also talking basically about the same thing that I'm saying right here.
So my views on affirmative action have sort of morphed over time. I think,
Fluctuated.
yeah, I think part of it is one, I'm big on defining terms, and I think a lot of people confuse affirmative action with racial preferences, with diversity, sort of writ large. I understand, Michael's point, but the honest, if we're being honest about it, Harvard, the black students that are going to Harvard are not coming from east of the river in Anacostia, generally speaking, or West Baltimore or East Flatbush, Brooklyn. We're not talking about the lowest income students. It's typically, middle class, black students who are, going to Ivy Leagues and other selective universities. And to your point, I do think because of the complexity of race and its evolving nature over decades, what ends up happening is that Asian students feel like they are paying for what the society says white people did to black people some number of years ago. And I think ultimately you can't have equality in any sense when you are subjecting different people to different standards of assessment based on skin color, ethnicity, or any other immutable characteristic. And that's what's actually happening at Harvard. So a few data points. Harvard has, the applicants ranked in deciles. So, first to 10th being the highest, number one being the lowest. A black student in the 4th decile has a higher chance of being admitted into Harvard than an Asian student in the 10th decile. Now, mind you, if you're in the 4th decile at Harvard, you're not some schlub. You'd probably be in the 8th decile at the University of Massachusetts. But that student is being given an artificial bump over a student who has a more competitive academic background because of this notion that this is going to, I guess, redress some of the issues that have gone on with race in our country's past. And I don't think that's sustainable. And I think the biggest reason why, and I think Michael knows this and would acknowledge this, is that racial preferences are unsustainable because it's something that its proponents demand but will never claim. Because we'll say, oh, we need racial preferences to keep the Ivy Leagues diverse. But then any particular black student who's there say, oh, you only got in because of racial preferences. They say, oh, no, that's not true. I earned my way here. So those two things are irreconcilable. And none of us want to feel as if we're being tokenized.
Now, as you saw from there, he also mentions how, again, you're then only viewed through that lens of affirmative action or, a diversity hire in a sense. And he touches on something about equality. I do believe that equality of opportunity should be across the board, but equality of outcome, that is a no-go. And when you have these kinds of measures put in place, that's kind of what you end up getting is equality of outcome, and people then get shafted. And when he talks about Asian people having to now deal with stuff that they say the white people did to black people and this and that, you don't fix past discriminations with present discriminations. That's not a way that people should be living. But as I aforementioned, the education system failing Joy Reid and all these younger students and these smart kids, after affirmative action happens, we get articles from the New York Post saying, or New York Times saying, with the Supreme Court decision, college admissions could become more subjective. This is not something we need. We need it to stay objective. But right here in the 3rd paragraph, it says, officials at some universities predict that there will be less emphasis on standardized metrics like test scores and class rank, and more emphasis on personal qualities told through recommendations and the application essay. The fact that some people are thinking that this is now the answer, where they're like, okay, well, we can't implement affirmative action, so what we'll do is we will actually have somebody write about their struggles and their race and all this stuff in the essay, and then that way we can pick through that. It's ludicrous. And there was another article written for the New York Times. The application essay will become a place to talk about race. Now they did think about this with the ruling, and the Chief Justice also took a look at this, and he said that universities may not simply establish through the application essays or other means the regime we hold unlawful today. He wrote, "What cannot be done directly cannot be done indirectly. However, some educators already, Shannon Gundy, the director of the undergraduate admissions at the University of Maryland, said students should tailor their admissions essays to describe how race had affected their lives." She goes on to say, "Right now, students write about their soccer practice, they write about their grandmother dying. They don't write about their trials and tribulations. They don't write about the challenges that they've had and experienced." That should have no relevance in you getting into these schools. This perpetuates like an oppression Olympics of victimhood. Like, none of this matters. If you test well, if you know your information, if you're able to get the grades required, then that should be all that's based. There's another article as well saying 5 ways college admissions could change. And again, this is also talking about how students can change what they need to write within the essay, and how the personal essay becomes more important. You know, it's crazy that this is now where we are in our world, where people think that they need to emphasize this kind of stuff. But, you know, as always, I love to hear from you guys. I had great conversations in some of the comments earlier. If you have anything to say, please say it in the comment section below, and I will catch you guys on the next one. Thanks so much.